sermon and song, and we all look forward to that. Please, at the appropriate time, take a song book and join Hardy in the singing. I want to remind you just of a couple of things. The Edgewood Ladies' Day is this coming Saturday, and if you're interested in that, there's information on the bulletin board about it. I want to again remind you that our gospel meeting begins on April 28th. That won't be long. Alan's going to have a reflux test on Tuesday, so please pray for him that everything will be all right as a result of that. Pray for all the sick that are in our bulletin and others that you know about. Could we begin now with a short prayer? Father, we thank you for another wonderful Lord's Day that you've given us, for the opportunities of worship and service that have been afforded to us today. We're thankful now that we have this opportunity to come together again and worship you in song and a lesson from your word and in prayer and in the reading of your word. Please pray, be with us as we do that, that everything we do and say will be in harmony with your will. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Turn your books to page 680. It's page 680. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. None else could heal all our souls' diseases. No, not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggle. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. No friend like him is so high and holy. No, not one. No, not one. And yet no friend is so meek and lowly. No, not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggle. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. There's not an hour that he is not near us. No, not one. No, not one. No night so dark, but his love can cheer us. No, not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggles. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. Same with page 138. It's page 138. Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long. Why
see it on the screen. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth.
Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we're truly grateful for another opportunity on this Lord's Day to assemble for worship. And Father, we're grateful for the worship this morning, and we pray, Father, that all that we said and done was in accordance with your will. Father, we thank thee for the Bible, which is a light to our feet, food to our soul, and a guide to salvation and eternal life. We're so thankful, Father, for the simplicity of the Bible. We're so thankful for thy Son, Christ, for all he has done, is doing, and will continue to do for us. Thank thee, Father, for the church that he established through his death and the shedding of his blood. We're thankful, Father, for his teachings. We're grateful for every member that is here. We're thankful for the church throughout the world. And we pray, Father, that the work that is done will bring forth fruit. We're thankful, Father, for the upcoming gospel meeting that we're going to have here. We pray, Father, that each one of us will prepare for that meeting, do all that we can to make sure that it's as good as it can be. And we pray, Father, that much fruit will come from that meeting. Many in the community will come and to hear the gospel. We thank thee, Father, for the many blessings of life that you provide for us, some that we don't realize. And we pray, Father, that you would continue to bless us with the things in which we need. Father, we're grateful for your love for us, for your long suffering for us, and your second pardon that you give us, provided for us when we fall. And we pray, Father, that as we walk through this life, that we would grow spiritually every day, and gain and grow in knowledge, and able to teach others about thy Son and the path to salvation. We pray, Father, for the lost. We pray that they will all have the opportunity to hear the gospel, to believe it, and obey it before it's too late. And we pray, Father, that as Christians, as we study the Bible, and as we gain more knowledge, that our sins will be less, and that we would strive to produce more fruit. Father, we love the church. We love thee and thy Son. And we love the fact that you prepared a way for us to spend eternity with thee and thy Son, and all Christians from this life is over. Father, we can never thank thee enough for the love that you have for us. Father, we pray that you would be with us as we go through this worship service tonight. Be with us as we sing, be with us as we pray, be with us as we read from the Scriptures. May we be attentive to what we're doing. May we listen carefully. We're grateful for each soul that is here. Father, we're so grateful for the unity that we have here grateful for the love that we have for one another. And Father, above all, for the truth. Continue to bless each one of us in our efforts to do thy will. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Let's show them which page 702. Page 702. Trials dark on every hand, and we cannot understand all the ways that God would lead us to that blessed promised land. But He'll guide us with His eye, and we'll follow till we die. We will understand it better by and by. By and by, when the morning comes, all the saints of God are gathering home. We will tell the story, how we've overcome. We will understand it better by and by. All our cherished plans have failed, disappointments have prevailed, and we wandered in the darkness, heavy-hearted and alone. But we're trusting in the Lord, and according to His word, we will understand it better by and by. By and by, when the morning comes, all the saints of God are gathering home. We will tell the story, how we've overcome. We will understand it better by and by. Temptations, hidden snares, often take us unawares, and our hearts are made to bleed for some thoughtless word or deed. And we wonder why the test, when we try to do our best. We will understand it better by and by. By and by, when the morning comes, all the saints of God are gathering home. We will tell the story, how we've overcome. We will understand it better by and by. Go ahead, mark our hymn books to page 971. Page 971. We got song reputation this evening. 971. Yeah, mark page 971. Let's turn to page 523. 523. There is beyond the azure blue no God concealed from human sight. He tints the sky with heavenly hue, and framed the worlds with His great mind. There is a God, He is alive, and we live and we survive. From the start of
This scripture reading will come from Acts 20, verse 7. And it reads, "And on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight."
We had a great lesson this morning from Brother Frank on this subject of acceptable worship. We continue that theme this evening with the sermon in song. And you'll remember this morning that Brother Frank had in his lesson examples of acceptable worship. And he gave us some of those great examples from the Bible of people who worshiped God acceptably, beginning all the way back from the very first example of worship in Genesis chapter 4. And in talking with Brother Frank about his lesson this morning, and the fact that the sermon and song this evening was on the same subject, so the devotional would be along those same lines also, one of the comments he made was that there are so many great examples of worship in the Bible, there's no way you could put them all in one lesson. And so we're certainly not lacking for material in continuing that discussion this evening and looking at further examples of acceptable worship this evening. And as Frank emphasized to us this morning, as Jesus spoke to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well, the only reason that we're able to worship, that we're able to even contemplate what is acceptable worship and what it means to approach God in worship, and to discuss what is necessary for acceptable worship, as Frank so eloquently described to us this morning. The only reason we're even able to discuss that is because Christ died for our sins. And as we think about examples of acceptable worship, we have one such example in Genesis chapter 22, that in that example of worship in Genesis chapter 22, with Abraham being told to go and offer his son Isaac, we have a foreshadowing, if you will. That would be the term that we would use when we see something early on in a movie that kind of points to something that's going to happen later on in the movie. Or when we're reading a story and we read something early on in the story that points to something or that kind of hints at something that's going to happen later on in the story, that's foreshadowing. The Hebrews writer refers to the shadows of the Old Testament and the substance of the New Testament. There is a tremendous foreshadowing here in Genesis chapter 22. And we know the account there, the account in Genesis 22 of Abraham being told to go and offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering. And God tells him, "Go to the place that I will show you and offer your son Isaac there as a burnt offering to me." And we're all very familiar with the story. We've studied it. We've heard it read and discussed many times. Abraham got up early in the morning. He got all of the things together that was necessary to go and make that sacrifice, the wood and the fire and all of the things that were necessary. He loaded up the mules and took the young men with him to help him carry the things along the way that they would need. And he traveled to the place that God told him to go and make that offering, Mount Moriah. When he got there, he told the young men, "You wait here. The lad and I will go yonder." How we know Abraham was from Georgia. He said, "We'll go over yonder had no doubt in his mind, not for a second, that Isaac was going to be coming back down off of the mountain with him. Because God told Abraham that his seed would be called through Isaac. And so Abraham knew. He had no doubt. It was such a tremendous declaration of Abraham's faith in God that he had no doubt in his mind whatsoever that Isaac was going to be just fine. And you go over to Hebrews chapter 11, and you read about this event and how the Hebrew writer says there in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham thought he had it worked out in his own mind. He thought he had it all worked out how God was going to do this. Sometimes we think we've got things all worked out in our mind, and God doesn't do it the way we think it's going to work out, but He does it, and He works it out in His own way. See, Abraham thought that he was going to go up there and he was going to offer Isaac, and Isaac was going to burn up on that altar, and then God was going to raise him up from that offering. And so he could tell the young men with full assurance, we're going to worship, and we're coming back. He did not believe he was going to come back down off that mountain by himself. And as they're going up the mountain, Isaac says, hey, here's the wood and here's the fire. Oh, where is the lamb for the offering? And Abraham looks at his son, who he believed was going to be the offering. And he said, my son, God will provide the offering. And when Abraham said that, he believed that offering was going to be Isaac. And they go up on the mountain and they prepare the altar, and you gotta really be impressed with Isaac's submission to his father, because you're talking about a teenage boy and a very elderly man. Now, we certainly get the impression from these Old Testament characters that they retained their strength into advanced years. But it would still be somewhat hard to believe that Abraham, who was 100 years old when Isaac was born, is now going to subdue and bind a strong teenage boy and put him on that altar against his will. I just don't believe he could have done that. Isaac had to be in submission to his father when Abraham told him, okay, son, now I'm going to tie you up and I'm going to put you on this altar. And Isaac submitted to his father. Did Abraham explain to Isaac, don't worry, son. God said you are the promised son. God said that my seed would continue through you. Don't worry, son. Whatever happens here, you're going to be okay. And Isaac was a man of Abraham's faith. Just like we're supposed to be people that have that same strong faith like Abraham had. And it may be Isaac had that same conviction that his father did. However it played out there, Isaac ended up on that altar. And just as Abraham was about to plunge the knife into his son, to offer his son a sacrifice, the angel called out. And don't you know Abraham was sure glad to hear God's call at that time. Abraham, Abraham. And of the times that God called Abraham and he said, here I am, I imagine he said, here I am quickest that time. Here I am. And he said, now I know. Essentially paraphrasing, of course, now I know just how strong your faith really is. And they turn, and there's a ram caught in the thicket. And you have that example of substitutionary sacrifice. substitutionary sacrifice, where the ram, it says, was offered instead of his son Isaac. Notice what it says in verse 13 of Genesis 22. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering. Notice what it says. And if you mark anything in that passage, mark this. Instead of his son. That substitutionary sacrifice. The ram took the place of Isaac. The reason that we're able to come together, as we heard read just a moment ago on the first day of the week, to break bread to remember the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. The reason we're able to come together on the first day of the week and offer up acceptable worship to God is because Jesus died for our sins. Jesus was the substitutionary sacrifice to pay the price for our sins, so that through hearing His word and believing what it says about Christ and His kingdom, believing that, repenting of our sins, and confessing that we believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, making that confession with mouth unto salvation, we can be baptized into Christ so that His sacrifice takes our place for the death penalty of sin. Just like the ram took the place of Isaac for the burnt offering. The death of Christ takes the place for our death penalty because of sin. What is it that necessitates these offerings? It's sin. What was it that necessitated Christ's death on the cross? It's sin. Not His own, but ours. He was the substitutionary sacrifice for ours. And in this example of Abraham's worship, as Frank talked about this morning, there are some things that are necessary for acceptable worship, and we see three of those things in this passage. Number one, we have to go to the place that God has said. See, God didn't tell Abraham, just go to the most convenient mountain. Just go to the closest mountain. Just go to the prettiest mountain. He didn't tell Abraham, go to the mountain that has the most programs and the most amenities and the most comfortable seats. Go to that mountain, Abraham. That's not what He told him. He said, go to the mountain that I will show you. And I would dare say that all of us that come to this place to offer up acceptable worship to God, we drive by a lot of much bigger buildings, much nicer buildings. We drive by a lot of places that probably have a lot of programs and a lot of activities and beautiful edifices on their buildings. So why is it that we drive by all of those places to come here? Because this is the place that God has said. Certainly, not talking about this building specifically, but we come to this place because this is the place where the worship that we offer up to God is the worship that He has specified. And we worship Him, as Frank talked about this morning, in spirit and in truth, as we heard read just a moment ago. We know that in this place, that this is the place that is offering up worship to God in spirit and in truth, as He has said. So just as He told Abraham, go to the mountain that I will show you, we know that when we come to this place, with the direction of the elders of this place, and the teaching and the study that we engage in this place, that we know that we're worshiping the way that God has said. So we go to the place that God has specified, His one true church. Not just the most convenient church, or the biggest church, or the prettiest church, or the church with the most programs, or the church with the most comfortable pews. But the church that worships the way that He has said. And then number two, in this passage, we see in this example from Abraham, and his worship to God, we have to be prepared for our worship to God. It says Abraham rose up early in the morning, and he got all of the things ready that he would need when he got to the place that God was sending him to worship. He got the wood ready, he got the fire ready, so when he got there, he wasn't just going to show up and not be prepared to worship. When Abraham showed up at where God sent him, he was prepared. He was ready to worship. And we go through our weeks Monday to Saturday, and every morning we wake up, we've typically prepared the day before, at least the day before, if not long before that, for what we're going to be doing that day. We go to jobs that we spent years preparing for in some cases, with schooling and college and all of the preparations we've made for those jobs, to do those things, to engage in those activities. Or we go and we engage in hobbies that we've spent a lot of time and money preparing for. Man, talk to an avid golfer. At the time and money that has been invested in that. And I got these custom clubs. Ooh, these things are nice. You ought to hear it when it hits the ball. Boom! It's a beautiful sound. Or a fisherman talking about his rods and reels. Man, this ugly stick, if you don't know brand names of fishing rods, Mary, that's an ugly stick. I want an ugly stick. An ugly stick or a Shakespeare with this reel on it, man, it just whizzes. And all the time and money and preparation for those things. And then get up Sunday morning, as Frank pointed out again this morning. Get up Sunday morning and we're supposed to be going to church. Don't have a thought in the world for what we're supposed to be doing when we get there. Abraham was prepared before he left. Had everything he needed when he got there to worship. Now, if I came walking in here on Sunday morning, or if Frank came walking in here Sunday morning this morning, and just as he was getting ready to get up and preach, he started digging through his Bible for something to preach. Oh, what am I going to, get up here and put his Bible up on the podium and start digging through here and say, what am I going to talk about? Hang on a minute. Let me find something to preach on. What would we think of that? What would you think if I got up here and I just started flipping through my Bible and saying, well, what would y'all like to hear this morning or this evening? What would y'all like to hear? Give me an idea. I know one thing is for sure, we'll be having an elders meeting right after, if it even took that long. See, I have to be prepared. The song leaders, they have to be prepared. What about the ones serving on the table? Now, I know some will say, well, we don't know when we get there. Walter asked us, that morning. Walter come up to us on the spot and said, you want to serve on the table? Okay, I'll serve on the table. Or you say the open prayer, say the closing prayer. Okay, well then, if we don't know before time that we might be doing that, then we ought to be prepared. If somebody called me right now and said, you want to go fishing? I'm already prepared to go fishing. If somebody called up one of you to go play golf, you're ready to go play golf because you're already prepared for that. Well, why can't we come already prepared to do whatever it is we're called on to do? Well, the Bible class teacher's not here this morning. Who can fill in? Volunteers? One of the children's classes, Bible class teacher's sick this morning. Any volunteers? Who's prepared to step up and fill in? Are we prepared? We have this example of necessary things that are necessary for worship. In addition to the things that Frank talked about this morning, being prepared to worship is necessary for scriptural worship, is necessary for worshiping in spirit and in truth. Doesn't the fact that Jesus said that acceptable worship to God is in spirit and in truth, don't both of those things necessitate preparation? I have to have my heart right, don't I? I have to have my heart prepared to engage in the worship. So worshiping in spirit necessitates preparation, doesn't it? And in truth, doesn't that necessitate preparation? How can I be prepared to worship the way that Jesus said that I must worship? God is spirit, and they that worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. How can I be prepared to worship in truth if I don't know what the truth about worship is? So I have to be prepared for that, don't I? I have to know that. So, going to the place that God has said is necessary for scriptural worship. And being prepared is necessary for scriptural worship. They got there to the place that God sent them. Abraham had the wood ready, laid out the wood, had the things that he needed to put the altar together, and had what he thought was going to be the offering ready to put on the altar. Abraham was prepared. We need to be prepared for worship. And the third thing is that when we've come to worship to the place that God has specified, and we've prepared our hearts, both with the right attitude and with the right knowledge, for worship, then when we've worshiped, we've left an acceptable sacrifice. Isn't that what Abraham did? Abraham left an acceptable sacrifice. He said the ram was being offered instead of Isaac. And God provided the ram. God told him what to offer, and he offered what God told him to offer. He left an acceptable sacrifice. When we come together for worship, if we've not come to the place that God has specified, we've not come prepared to worship, then we're not going to leave an acceptable sacrifice. You know, I don't know how many times I've heard people say, now of course, you know, not about, you know, the congregations where I've preached, but I don't know how many times I've heard people say, oh, I just didn't get anything out of that worship service. Now, I know nobody says that about, you know, after I've preached, but, you know, they'll say, well, I just didn't get anything out of that lesson, or I didn't get anything out of that service. And I heard a preacher talking about that one time. Maybe you've heard it also. And he was talking about people complaining about the worship service. Well, it didn't motivate me. I didn't get anything out of it. It was kind of dry. It was, you know, it just wasn't an uplifting worship service. And kind of complaining about the worship service. And I loved his response. What he said was the way that he responded to people when he would hear things like that. That I didn't get anything out of that. He would ask them, well, what did you put into it? Isn't that the truth? You get out of something what you put into it. When we come together to worship God in spirit and in truth, are we putting our whole heart into that? Didn't Jesus say, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and mind? And where else should that be more evidently expressed than in our worship? That our love for God is being expressed with our whole heart. That we're loving the God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind. And we're pouring that into our worship. Now, if somebody's doing that, how in the world could they say that they didn't get anything out of that? So, we have to go to the place that God has specified. We have to prepare for the worship that we're going to offer to God. And we have to leave an acceptable sacrifice. It may be this evening that you know you're in the right place. You know what God expects of you. But you know that right now your worship is not going up before God because you've not been added to the place that he has specified, his church, the church of Christ. The church that Paul said he purchased with his own blood. Acts chapter 20, verse 28. And you know that you need to come, having heard the gospel, to be baptized into Christ, to have your sins washed away by his blood, so that, having done that, you can begin to offer up acceptable worship to God. You will be prepared to offer up acceptable worship to God. Or if, having done that, you know that there are things in your life that are hindering your worship to God. As Frank pointed out this morning, that our lifestyle determines whether our worship is acceptable to God or not. We can be worshiping God in just the exact way that he specified to be worshipped, but if our lifestyle's not right, he doesn't accept that worship. And you know that there are things in your life that you need to repent of and you need to ask God's forgiveness of, so that your worship can go up before God as a sweet-smelling aroma, a sacrifice well-pleasing in his sight. Whatever your need is this evening, pray that come.
Restore my spirit, Lord, I need restore. My heart is weary, please help me, dear Lord. I stand in need of more strength from your word. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Revive the fire, Lord, rebuild my soul. Stir my desire to work in your will. Light in my heart, dear God, your zeal grown cold. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Renew my courage, Lord, it needs restore. My cup is empty, refill it, dear Lord. Replace all doubts and fears with faith so bold. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Do I have anyone who would take the Lord's Supper? Okay, let's turn to page 645. Page 645. Give you an opportunity. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross, where the dearest and best for world
like now, Father, we offer our thanks for this cup, which is to us that blood that was shed on Calvary's cross to wash away our sins. We pray that you continue to be with the one who take of this, that they'll also remember what it really means for them. We ask in Christ's name. Amen. At this time, we will give anybody who didn't have an opportunity this morning to lay by and store that opportunity tonight. Do we have anybody? Let's pray. Oh, our merciful Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the many wonderful blessings that you bestow upon each one of us, both spiritual and physical. And we pray now that you be the one laying by and store a portion of that which they have gotten this past week, that they'll do so in a loving and cheerful manner, where the work may be carried on in this place and your word spread throughout the area. This is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen.
Turn to page 297. Page 297. Let's stand for dismissal, please. I want to be a worker for the Lord. I want to love and trust His holy word. I want to sing and pray and be busy every day in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work. I will pray in the vineyard.
Leave this place now, that you would watch over us and protect us. Take us to our destination